several years now, alarm bells have been sounding off and on when it comes to Nigeria and the issue of its debt. But recently, those alarms have turned to constant warnings of how dire the situation may be for Africa's largest economy. And now the alarms have reached their highest yet as the International Monetary Fund is projecting that by 2026, debt servicing will consume all of Nigeria's revenue. According to the Debt Management Office, Nigeria's total debt profile rose to its highest level in 2021, hitting a record high of 39.56 trillion naira, about $95.78 billion as of December 2021. This represents a 6.64 trillion naira increase compared to the 32.92 trillion naira recorded as of the same period of the previous year. The IMF's resident representative for Nigeria, Ari Aisen, said at the presentation of the Sub-Saharan African Regional Economic Outlook, said that based on the micro-fiscal stress test they ran on Nigeria, interest payments on debts may wipe out the country's entire earnings in the next 4 years. Meanwhile, the IMF reported earlier this year that the government spent 4.2 trillion naira on debt servicing between January and November 2021, accounting for 76.2% of the 5.51 trillion naira in income collected during that period. In the fiscal year of 2022, the Nigerian government intends to spend 3.61 trillion naira on debt servicing, accounting for nearly 34% of the federal government's estimated revenue. Following plans by the Debt Management Office to borrow an extra 6.39 trillion naira to finance the 2022 budget deficit, Nigeria's debt stock, which was around 39.56 trillion naira in December of 2021, is expected to reach 45.95 trillion. Is Africa's largest economy on the path to a debt crisis? Let's get into the conversation right now. This is Business Edge. I'm Tolulokwe Adileru Balogun. Joining me today is Gospel Obele. He's the chief economist for Streetnomics. Gospel, welcome back to Business Edge once again.
Thank you for having me, Tolu.
So let me set the picture for this. So over the last 5 years, from 2017 to 2021, Nigeria has spent 13.75 trillion naira on debt servicing, which is about 3 times the amount spent in the preceding 5 years. That's 4.89 trillion between 2012 and 2016. Now, debt servicing costs in the past 5 years represent over 19% of Nigeria's annual real GDP. In a space of 10 years, 2012 to 2021, Nigeria's debt service to revenue ratio skyrocketed from 21.6% to 96%. Now, looking at the trend, is the IMF right that Nigeria's debt servicing could consume all of its revenue by 2026? Gospel, what do you think? Let's start from there.
Right, yeah. So the IMF has a very solid argument, particularly, because it's been keeping track of the Nigerian economy for a long time, and also knowing that there's been a long history of fiscal indiscipline, and how debt has been managed or expended over the period, as it were. So it's there's a very high likelihood. But then again, the conversation right now is to begin to look at the positives in terms of how can we shore up not just revenues, but ensure that debt monies are deployed in the productive spots or sectors, for the right returns that we need to be able to service, as it were. Also, there's another conversation on the table, will be the fact that globally interest rates are going high, so which means that debt servicing is going to be much more expensive, when you think about it as an interest expense, for nations. And in that context, it will mean that we'll be spending much more amount of money trying to service our debt, especially with the context, within the context of the failing currency as well. So if you put all of these dynamics together, of course, there's a likelihood that that percentage share on revenue will go up, but to 100%, I think it's still a developing story. So let's watch and see.
All right. So there are a lot of numbers to follow in this conversation, a lot of data. We've had the conversation about the debt to GDP and the debt to revenue ratio conversation out of all of it. And the debt to GDP ratio is currently around the country's upper limit as it stands now. But IMF again says that by 2027, that should reach 44.2%. And that still seems about prudent. The World Bank says it should be about 55% of any country's GDP. And with the ECOWAS convergence ratio, that puts it at 70%. When it comes to this conversation, what numbers should we be focusing on? Is this a number to focus on, the debt to GDP ratio, or is it still a conversation about debt to revenue?
In my own simple opinion, it's just like when you talk about economic growth rates or growth in the sense and the way the world celebrates growth rates and GDPs, in quotes, are they really a sign of genuine recovery? Are they really a sign of the real recovery we're looking for? And all of that. That's the similar case we have here. The conversion of debt to GDP or debt to revenue ratio is a valid argument when you look at it from the metric standpoint, from global benchmarkings and all of that. But in my own opinion of trying to critique that argument clearly is the fact that can we focus more on the pool, of that debt spending? So in terms of debt investment, debt spending, debt financing, what are we financing with the debt? What are we spending with those debts? This is just a layman conversation. If the average Nigerian cannot see the benefits of increased borrowing, from the public expenditure standpoint, then that's enough cause for worry, way more than the debt to GDP ratio and all those technical jargon and arguments and all that. So I think we need to focus more on the economics of debt financing. Where are those monies going to? What channels are they being passed through? And which institutions are responsible for ensuring that debt monies are critically deployed, for high-end investment projects / sectors and all of that. If that's the conversation on the table, then we're ready to have a real conversation as to the potentials. Because then again, to balance out on this conversation is the fact that developed economies have higher debts. Mm-hmm. The reason why it's not a conversation is because those debt monies have been used to finance the right things. And if you flip it to the other side, there's sort of like a high-end return on investment in terms of infrastructure, human capital, education, and all the likes, and that balances out the argument for high debt conversation in those economies. But because you see the loophole of a failing economy and a failing revenue structure or revenue base, it now becomes, a top-line argument as to why are we doing this and debt to GDP ratio and debt to revenue conversations.
So this sort of circles back to something you mentioned with the answer to my first question, which is around the issue of fiscal indiscipline. And that's something that is a recurring theme across the continent. Bloated sizes of governments investing in projects that do not pay for themselves or will not bring back money in the long run. In Nigeria's case, where do you think the fiscal indiscipline comes into this conversation around debt servicing?
Honestly speaking, I think fiscal indiscipline is the core of the whole debt servicing, debt financing, economic mismanagement. In fact, economic mismanagement first, because you first have economic mismanagement to find yourself in a position where you need to borrow more and you cannot particularly use those monies rightly. If you look at our budgetary structure, which is supposed to be the most influential policy instrument or financial instrument, for development and all of that, the structure is really poorly designed, and it's not reform-based. The budgetary structure in Nigeria is not forward-thinking. It's not productive in its design, to kickstart productivity in the economy. And even how those monies are spent and where they're deployed and all of that. So there's a very strong fundamental economic ideology around management that doesn't pay or doesn't enable for us to be able to service our debts freely and, be able to kickstart or jumpstart the economy. So that's the fundamental base, and that's where fiscal discipline starts from on the core. And this is not a conversation about which administration is in power. It's a conversation of a cultural ideology that drives the Nigerian people, which automatically is being seen around leadership and all of that. So since the SAP eras, even the oil boom eras in the 1970s leading to the 1980s, these have been a conversation. We've not been able to manage our economy properly. As such, fiscal discipline kicked in. So in 2004, Dr. Koji and the then President Olusegun Obasanjo sought to, get the Paris Club to forgive about 60% of our debt. That was a success. But then again, if you look at the reality now, we've come back not just to where we were, but even in the worst case conversation, knowing fully well that your currency cannot compete within the context of the currencies you're borrowing with and all of that. So we're in a much more severe situation where you look at it from an economic management standpoint, which, fiscal indiscipline happens to be the core of that conversation, and everything sprouts from there. So it's not just debt services. The fact that you don't even have a properly diversified productive revenue structure in the first place, and then your public expenditure are not clearly cut out for capital projects. And then again, what do you redefine as capital projects, rather? And why do you have so much more recurrence than you have on capital? So the dynamics of economic management, economic structuring, and all of that enables for this fiscal indiscipline as an incentive. So if you want to deal with the debt service conversation that the IMF has pointed out, there are deeper structural issues that must be attacked and dealt with from an ideology perspective first.
All right, so let's talk about some of those deeper structural issues, because if Nigeria is spending 96% of its revenue to service debt, that means that revenue is not being spent elsewhere. So if the money is going to debt servicing, where is it not going that Nigeria needs to also be spending money on?
I mean, Nigeria needs to be spending money on clearly capital projects, clearly reform projects, and clearly competitiveness-driven projects in the sense, all right, what the drivers and the productivity elements that helps the nation stay competitive. Until the nation can become competitive and stay competitive, now there are two different conversations. Until the nation can become competitive and stay competitive, we may not be able to expand our revenue portfolio. Let me give you an instance. The Apple brand in the United States, the value of the Apple brand is close to about 70 plus trillion naira. That is almost times three times four of the overall Nigerian budget size. That's to tell you that we are not even near what the argument really is. Yet we are still misbehaving on what the fundamentals, what fundamentals should be in place. So we have a very long journey ahead of us, and the structure of what we have right now is a dead on arrival structure. And if you look at it from that context, the IMF is right.
Okay, so let's quickly talk about one more thing the IMF mentioned before we go on a break. And the residents' representative said that the institution subjected Nigeria to a macro fiscal stress test. So just quickly take us through what that means and what the IMF would have been looking at to arrive at the projection that Nigeria's debt servicing would, in their estimation, take about 100% of the country's revenue in the next few years.
Okay, so I'm trying to be very non-technical here. On a layman, when you talk about stress test, it means that you've modeled and put everything in place to test if the current structure, if the current narratives, if the current product services that you have can withstand the storms or withstand any challenges in the future, and all of that. So that's what it means. So the way the Nigerian economy is currently wired, can we get to a place where, we're earning much more revenue and probably the debt service to revenue ratio keeps shrinking, or would shrink rather, can we get to that place? So by the time you factor in all of those models and all that, you realize that the answer is a no. So, and on the flip side would mean that debt servicing is likely to take more chunk of that revenue if the current economic realities, are kept consistent or constant, through the period of time. Now, they're saying, I think 2024, 2026, somewhere around there, in the next 2 years would be a largely political driven year, and that's also inform a lot of these dynamics as well. So that's the conversation on ground. Can your current economic structure, economic productivity level get you to a point where you're spending less of your revenue on debt servicing? And the answer is currently no. So you can see some validity around the conversations of the stress test. But however, will it get to 100%? I think that's a developing story that will live for time to come. And the reason is because the way the world is headed right now, with the Russian-Ukraine war, threats of a looming recession, inflation, and all of these dynamics, you can't say yet, until we get there. But of course, in Nigerian conversation, Nigerian narratives, we're much more vulnerable to all of these things. So it may satisfy the argument in a sense.
All right, so Gospel, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll look at some of the issues around the possible options that Nigeria has. And as he has alluded to, it is an election year, and the issues of the economy, insecurity, education are all coming to the fore. But has the economy taken the rightful place as the conversations around who's going to be Nigeria's next president continue? The conversation is on after this. Still with me is Gospel Obele. He's the chief economist of Streetnomics. Now, officially, it is $1 to about 415 naira And on the black market, it is currently $1 to over 600 naira. And as Gospel and many have alluded to right now, it is an election year. And so that's going to dominate a lot of the conversation. But in terms of elections, we've seen it across the world where the economic situations tend to be the determining factor of why and how citizens come out. But do you think the current economic situations that Nigeria is facing, a weakened naira, not bringing in enough revenue as possible, also feeling the effects of the Russia-Ukraine crisis that may, of course, are not their fault, is not the country's fault, is the economic issue of the country getting enough attention from those who are vying to be the next president?
All right, so I'm looking for the right way to start the response. First off, it's very important to note that when you are in a pre-election year, it's all about political correctness. And that's the card, that's the game that the current delegates, candidates, and all the likes are currently playing right now, all right? To make it seem as though they are well aware of the issues and they're well prepared to take on the issues for reforms. And that script, that narrative is a correctness narrative, meaning that how well can you appeal to the pain and emotions of the people whom you want them to cast your votes for you and all of that. So that's the narrative, that's the script, and that's what happens globally. It's not a Nigerian thing, but for the Nigerian space, you have that. But you also have a major conversation, and which is on the part of the citizenry. Even the citizens are not aware of what they need to look out for. On the flip side, you also have conversations where even the citizens are not well aware of who, will be credible enough. Thirdly, is the fact that even the citizenry say they need change badly, but they are genuinely not ready for a change. So you have a cluster of all those issues coming to the table, and at the end of the day, political and social correctness gets to win the game. Meaning that how correct are you within the context of you trying to seem like you understand the conversation, and within the context of doing that, you're speaking to the emotions of the people, who act like they want a change. So that's what you have in the mix. And with that context, economic indicators, economic reforms, and priorities are the mercy of what will give either the incumbent party or whatever party would be the win in the next elections. And that's how it works. So inflation may not be a key topic, nothing serious may be done around it. Subsidy may not be a key topic, nothing serious, nothing may significantly change structurally. And technically would mean that we'll be losing a year. This is a pre-election year. After the pre-election year comes both the election and a transition year. So those are two different dynamics that would shape the Nigerian economy outcome in the next 1 year.
Like outcomes that will be to the benefits of the people. So let's talk about some of the possible options or avenues out. But unfortunately, Nigeria's government revenues have been constrained. We've seen an underperformance of oil revenue due to the continuous decline in production capacity and also the volatility on the international markets. We've also seen that despite an increase in the value-added tax from 5% to 7.5%, the non-oil revenue has still not been enough to fill the gap that's been caused by the underperformance of oil earnings. It seems like we're back to this question time and time again, but why has Nigeria seemingly struggled to address its revenue issues? We only look to oil and then occasionally look to non-oil, even though agriculture employs the most people in the country, even though tech has come up, even though creative industries are coming up. Why are we still simply not making enough money?
All right, thank you for the question. So 3 things that come to mind is number 1 is the fact, I'm not a tax expert, but one thing I know on the tax beat is that Nigeria's revenue problem will not be solved from pushing tax upwards. Nigeria's revenue challenge from a tax perspective will be solved from getting more people, inspired and willing, not forcing them to comply, to pay taxes. That's on one bit. Now, until you can work more on the tax base, inspiring and enabling compliance, not using your agencies to force people to comply, and then you're not now accountable for the finance or the monies. Until you can inspire and enable compliance on one block, all right, you will not be able to see any benefits technically on the tax angle, even if you increase 15%. Now, on the other bit where you talk about technology, agriculture, and a few other sectors, we need to understand that there's a lot of argument with the non-oil space that makes it unproductive for revenue. Number 1, you want to talk about the fact that even the agricultural sector you have now, if you check the GDP numbers, 90% of the agricultural framework is crop farming. What strategic revenue base can you extract from crop farming? All right, until agriculture moves from subsistence based to value added, all right, processing based. You may not be able to refine for value. So until there's some form of value addition in the process, you're not ready. So the government needs to begin to think of how do I, number one, put this market together. And what I mean by that is including technology and the likes, you have a lot of unorganized engagement in the non-oil sector space. You have a lot of informal engagement in non-oil sector space. So you have a lot of SMEs who are doing well with technology, but the sector is not organized for government revenue. So there's a need to organize the non-oil sector space. And in form of organizing them, you need to be able to engage them critically or enable them critically for value creation, like I mentioned in the agricultural space. And on the other bits of things, you need to, within the context of organization, ensure that they are well plugged into the international market, all right? Create the enabling factors to help for productivity and then channel those productivity for international engagements. That means if we have cocoa in Nigeria and that cocoa is processed into chocolates, the chocolates in Nigeria should be able to compete with the chocolates in the UK and in Switzerland. Until you have that and that critical response from those other markets, you are not ready to unlock your revenue structure. So we need some form of coordinated, organized, and institutional engagement in non-oil space, positioning them for access to market solutions more in order for us to be able to extract both local revenue and foreign exchange from that space. And then on the oil and gas market, what you have there is just fragmented conversations around self-interest and the like. So until we get the acts together, I don't think we'll have this revenue challenge solved, and we'll keep coming back to this conversation.
I need to ask you this question very quickly as we wrap things up, and I'll need a quick answer. But as you mentioned earlier, the Obasanjo administration was very successful in negotiating Nigeria's debts with the Paris Club. And as you said, we found ourselves back there and, in fact, beyond where we were just about 2 or 3 decades ago. But we've seen that there's an upward trajectory when it comes to Nigeria's debt obligations. And if 48.6% is owed to multilateral organizations, I can throw out some of the numbers. $3.63 billion to Exim Bank of China, $561.6 million to France, $164.27 million to Germany, and the list goes on and on. But we've seen also countries on the continent try to renegotiate or move towards debt forgiveness once again, especially in light of COVID and the effects on the economy. Very, very quickly, what should Nigeria do in terms of that? Can we be in a position once again to renegotiate or even urge for debt forgiveness from those that we owe money to?
So the truth is, even if you renegotiate and ask for debt forgiveness, we'll still come back to this place because we have been there before. The only reason why globally there seems to be like a soft side to loan restructuring and debt restructuring is because of the adverse effects of the recent global events on vulnerable economies. And Nigeria happens to be in that space. So it's just trying to look for areas where you can seek mercy. And in the context of even seeking mercy, nothing goes without anything else. Nothing goes for nothing in that context. What I would think of, because we've been down this road before, is we need to look at our major issues. Why are we here in the first place? All right. Our debts were forgiven by the Paris Club in 2004. Why do you want another forgiveness? And if you're forgiven a second time, if you're given a second chance, would you do the right thing? The answer is no. All right. So I think with that, I've answered the question. So I don't think any rational institution, I mean, the Nigerian borrowing in Nigeria is a culture in the sense. So we need to begin to find more sustainable solutions to it.
All right, Gospel, I'm sorry to cut you off there. And I know, as you said, this is a developing story. We'll be back here again having this conversation. But let's also hope that in the midst of a political year and elections and political transition, the core issues of the economy do not get lost. Thank you very much, Gospel Bailey, for joining me.
I hope not.
All right.
Thank you.
You're watching Business Edge. Up next, we have a few stories we'll quickly run you through, the ones we're keeping our eyes on. We start NC4 to watch in North Africa, where Egypt's petroleum ministry says it has awarded 8 gold and metal mining exploration licenses in the Eastern Desert region. This is a second test of a 2020 legislative overhaul designed to unlock vast untapped mineral resources. To the southern part of the continent now, where Car Power Ship, the world's biggest supplier of floating gas-fired power plants, has said that some South African government agencies are stalling its projects and their conduct isn't conducive to creating an attractive investment environment. British independent energy company Savannah Energy has entered into an agreement with the Ministry of Petroleum and Energy of the Republic of Chad for the rollout of 500 megawatts of renewable energy projects. In the deal, the company will supply electricity to the Doba oil project as well as to 2 towns in the southern region of the country. And finally, Kenya has signed 7 bilateral agreements with Sierra Leone aimed at enhancing relations between the two countries. One of the agreements is on the establishment of a joint commission for cooperation, while the 6 others are MOUs on political and diplomatic consultations, trade and investment, cooperation in wildlife, and more. And that's where we wrap up our conversations today. If you want to join us, head to our social media timeline. You can, of course, download our mobile app, follow us on YouTube, go to our website for more details of this conversation, and watch us on the platforms we are available. That's it for Business Edge. I'm Tolu Lokwe Adeleru Balogun.